Adam Kahane is a co-founder of Reos Partners, an international social impact organization that helps people move forward together on their most important and intractable issues. We are happy to have him at this podcast, sharing his journey in the last 30 odd years, his work, his thoughts on personal mastery, as well as his latest book, The Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, The Catalytic Power of Radical Engagement.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ramesh Ramachandra and the founder of Talent Leadership Crucible. We're excited to meet you today on the next episode of Mastery Effect Podcast.
Hi, my name is Poorani Thanusha. I'm the principal consultant with Talent Leadership Crucible and the co-founder of Impact Velocity. And I'm so happy to be here in this episode of The Mastery Effect with our special guest, Adam Kahane.
Adam, welcome to Mastery Effect Podcast. We created this podcast to support people to understand what personal mastery is about, as well as to create interest for the upcoming Society for Organizational Learning Forum, which is going to be held in September in Ho Chi Minh City. And we thought the best way to start is to have you introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm very excited about the forum and being with you in person, and I'm delighted to be on this podcast. So thank you very much for the invitation to both. Well, I'm Adam Kahane. I'm a Montrealer, Canadian. I'm a co-founder of a global social enterprise called Reos Partners, and Reos's work and my work for the past more than 30 years, helping people work together across their differences to make progress on their most important and intractable challenges. What I've been doing in many different places on many different subjects, but with the common theme, how do we work together, including with people we don't necessarily agree with or like or trust, in order to make progress on the things that matter. So that's been my day job, and the evening job has been reflecting on this this on-the-ground experience, much trial, much error, much learning, and writing books about it. And I've just published my 6th book about this, Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, and I'm really looking forward to discussing that with the participants in the forum.
So just asking you about personal mastery. What does it mean to you, and what's been your journey so far?
Well, it was interesting for me to read these questions from you because I realized that you're using a language which I know from a long time ago. I really got started in this work, or early on in this work, encountered the work of Dr. Peter Senge, but I haven't thought about these words for a long time, including this phrase personal mastery. So I had to look it up this morning as to what Peter had meant by it in his wonderful book, The Fifth Discipline. So let me talk about it as I think about it, which may not be exactly the same as the way Peter has written about it. But I guess I could say the focus of my work over the past 30 odd years is how to be effective in the world. And so I'm interested in this question of how can we understand what's going on around us, and how can we contribute to changing, or even more so transforming the systems of which we're part. So that's how I understand personal mastery in that practical way. And my own journey is that's what I've been doing since my first experience in 1991, my first experience of this sort in 1991 in South Africa during the period of the transition from apartheid to democracy, always over and over and over, working with teams of leaders, usually from different organizations and sectors, business people, politicians, non-governmental organization leaders, community leaders, academic faith leaders, etc., always working together, trying to transform the systems of which they're a part: food systems, education system, health systems, political systems, climate systems, energy systems, etc. And yeah, I find the work not easy or straightforward at all. And so my journey has been to try things and to succeed and fail, and through that to try to understand, yeah, what works.
One of the things that we've heard about personal mastery, or at least from the people that we've so far interviewed, that aspect of learning, right, is very much tied to mastery. And I guess that so in the personal space, that learning shows up as you taking on new things or uncomfortable things or different things, right? And exploring new ways and new worlds.
Well, to put it sharply, I'm willing to try things out that I don't know whether they'll work, and I'm pretty disciplined about learning from what doesn't work and trying to say what happened here and what can I learn from it. Years ago, Otto Scharmer told me a story that it's an important historical anecdote that the great scientist Charles Darwin was famous for paying attention specifically to disconfirming data, to things that are not as he thought they were, and to using those things that weren't the way he expected them to be or didn't work the way he thought they did as the way to learn how things work. And so that's really been my attitude. And if you look at my books, they're just a recitation of one failure after another, and how gradually I've been able to understand better how to make a difference.
One of the things that intrigued me just now, as you were sharing about how when you worked on the transition in South Africa in the early 90s, you started to look at the different systems. For instance, the food system, the education system, the energy system. That would have been really a systematic way of looking at things and seeing how you can have the highest leverage for each of these pieces. We do something similar with family businesses and different systems, but I don't see a lot of that happening on a day-to-day basis. Why do you think people don't take on looking at things from a systems perspective? What could be the barrier?
Well, I'll answer your question, but just to clarify, when I gave that list of systems, I wasn't referring specifically to that first project in looking at South Africa as a whole, but focusing primarily on economic and political matters. The list I gave was of the work of Reos over the decades since. But it's a good question why people don't do that more. I guess because most people focus on what is closest and most immediate to them. As Peter used to point out in the early days when he had people play the systems, there was a system simulation called the beer game, I think a simulation of a beer production and marketing company, that over and over people focus just on the thing that was immediately in front of them, or more specifically on the person that was immediately in front of them, and blamed them or reacted to them without understanding at all that although individual actions matter, the way the system works matters as much or more. So I think it's this, yeah, Barry Oshry calls it system blindness, maybe over-personalizing.
Interesting, because I guess the antidote to systems blindness now, as even if Peter Senge is doing more of that, is systems awareness, right? Like, how do you cultivate system awareness as prerequisite to even talking about systems? Otherwise, systems show up very conceptually. For many of us, system is very conceptual. We still don't recognize systems.
I've been saying the last few months that one of the gifts of the current difficult situation we're in the world, it's becoming more and more obvious that we're living in systems, whether it's climate systems or trade systems or political systems or security alliance systems, that these systems obviously constrain us and provide affordances to us, and that although we might have thought they're solid and stable, they're not. They're fluid. They can be changed. They are being changed, in some cases peacefully, in some cases violently. I think that's a bit of the gift of the current environment, is it's so obvious that what's happening to us is not simply the result of what the person next to us is doing, but larger sets of actors and relationships and structures.
Thank you for spending the time to engage in that discussion. Because if I really look back at my own journey, and this is what I asked Poorani as well, we started the transition into systems thinking and systems awareness about 10 years ago. But now it's come to a point where I can't imagine how it was before. And sometimes we struggle in trying to create that for people newly. We also wanted to ask you a little bit about the work that you did with scenario planning and your core framework that guides your work. It's in any of these consulting that you do or you have done in the last 30 years. How would you describe it?
First of all, we made the decision early on in Reos Partners that we weren't going to try to have one single framework or one single theory, or for that matter, one single guru. So the work is a bit eclectic, but I think it's a version of what you have been describing, working with systems, to some extent organizational systems. Our specialty is cross-organizational systems, so sectors or societies. In particular, this idea or this approach that says that the way to understand systems and the way to transform them is to work with other actors who are located in different positions in the system and have different perspectives on the system. That's how we can affect change democratically and dialogically, rather than force change, impose change unilaterally or violently. That's been the area of work. And then within that, of course, there's lots of tools. The tools for us are secondary to meeting that objective, but those tools include tools of systems thinking, like those that you know, scenario planning, which is simply telling multiple stories about how the system could evolve as a way of making better informed decisions about what we can do now. Approaches to leading across systems. I guess you could call it systems leadership, which is different from organizational leadership or team leadership.
Right.
And coming back to the first question you asked, what do all of those require of us individually? Not to say that the work is only individual. The work is almost by definition collective. Systems are not built or rebuilt by any one person. It's always a collective activity, but nonetheless, we each have to figure out what we can do and how we can contribute and what capacities we need to be able to contribute to that systemic work. So that's the domain of Rios's work, and we've focused especially on how to do that with high complexity, high conflict situations.
I was going through your book, there was a statement that jumped out, something about the individual change and the collective change go hand in hand, right? It's kind of like they're reflective of each other. I'm not sure that's how you meant it, which I thought was very much matching what we are speaking about personal mastery too. Engaging in individual change that is then a match for what we are able to connect to and see out there in the world, the collective change that we want.
It's some kind of yin yang complementarity, but I find this argument or this about personal or systemic to be almost silly. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think that it's true that if I change myself, the world will change. I know there's people who say that, but that's not my experience at all. And ultimately, that approach is, I guess the word is solipsistic, of navel gazing. And I also don't think the other is true, that we can work on systemic change without any a change in ourselves. So to me, yeah, I guess you'd say two sides of the same coin. And ultimately, the way I think about it, the only instrument we have to affect systemic change is ourselves and what we do and don't do. And so we become able to influence the world through shifting what we're thinking and doing. So it always struck me as a bit of a nonsensical differentiation.
Yeah, because it's co-emerging. I mean, it's kind of happening at the same
Yeah,
time, right? So the
yeah,
other.
co-emerging. That's a great, yeah, co-emerging.
Could you take us through an example of a project that you did?
The most dramatic example that I can think of, which is the one that I've described in first chapter or the Habit One chapter of the most recent book. A few years ago, I was working in Canada, my home country. After many years of working elsewhere, I was working on a project with indigenous people in the province of Manitoba, a project related to health care for indigenous people in Manitoba. And it was a group of indigenous leaders from across that sector, officials of health agencies and doctors and nurses and traditional leaders and others. When we got started, I was describing my global background, and one of the leaders said straight up to me in front of everybody, "I don't trust you." A man named George Moosewagon. Of course, I was shocked and a bit panicked, but I did understand within a few seconds what was going on, that this wasn't a personal thing. What he was saying was that we have, well, to put it in his words, as we discussed it later, we have a long history of people coming from outside uh, telling us what to do. That really hasn't worked out for us over the centuries, especially white Canadians telling us they think they know what we ought to do. And this is a very bad start to our workshop. And this was very helpful to me because I was indeed thinking of myself as somebody from outside who was an expert and a consultant and a facilitator who wasn't really involved much in this situation and therefore was looking at it from outside and above. But I guess the deeper meaning of what he was saying is you're not outside, Adam. You are, in fact, in as much as you are a white Canadian settler, to use the terminology in Canada, then you're not apart from the problem, you're part of the problem. Or you're, to say it in more neutral terms, you're part of the system, you're not outside the system. And this was very helpful. And I did understand pretty quickly what was happening. And we took a break and we discussed it in our facilitation team, which included a number of, well, it was mostly first indigenous facilitators. And we changed immediately and dramatically what we were doing to center indigenous leadership and way of working and facilitating. And I, in particular, took a much more of a backseat role. So this is an example of we're trying to make a difference in the system. In this case, the system that produces, or more accurately, doesn't produce healthcare for Indigenous people in the province of Manitoba. The system is showing up in the room. The roles are all there, or if you look carefully, you can see all the roles that are there. And we can only be effective at changing the system if we change what we're doing. And in that particular case, if I could change what I was doing, which I did, and it worked very well. So that's one example that I can think of.
In some ways, you sort of mirrored the change, like
Yes.
for them to see that you were willing to set aside whatever frame that when you recognized you were also part of the system was a clear indication for them to see that they too can set aside something because now it was shifting.
Yes, I suppose. But the most important thing was, if I wanted to simplify the dominant dynamic in the system of Indigenous people in Canada the last 100 or 200 years has been domination by white authorities or experts or colonialists, however you want to call it. And so I was stepping out of that role, or I was abandoning that role, and that allowed something else to happen.
Right.
And in particular, this group of people to find their own way forward with some modest support by me and my colleagues, but without me
The front.
instructing them.
Yeah.
So I'm giving that as an example of the relationship between the system and the individual. In that case, we needed to change our relationship in order for the situation we were dealing with to be able to be transformed.
Like you said, to some extent, in that particular example, it's lucky, or at least that George was willing to say what he said up front, right? Versus keeping silent and holding it, and whatever happened just before he said that might have allowed for that, right? Yeah.
At least in my way of thinking about it, a testimony to his personal mastery. He could see that clearly, he could say it clearly, and say it this is the most important thing, but say it, he wasn't angry, he was just stating a fact. And he stated, and because he said it with such clarity and calmness, I could hear it without defending myself and otherwise trying to shut it down. I can imagine in other circumstances I would have done.
Yeah.
And so we collectively, he, I, the other people in the meeting, the other facilitators, were able to quite quickly and easily shift. And as we shifted, the room shifted, and as the room shifted, the system was able to shift, because these people, the people in the room, were leaders of that system, and therefore could start to imagine and enact a different way for that system to be.
It's a hopeful example that we don't have to go in thinking that we are the ones who have to have it all handled, because in the system, there are people who have something to offer, and we listen, right, or willing to listen and adapt or adjust. And then that's how we cause the system to change versus being fixed.
I think I'd put it much more strongly than that, Poorani, which is that really we rarely have an opportunity to fix a system. My own experience in my company and in my family and in my community, I don't have much capacity to fix what people are doing, hardly at all, let alone as a consultant and facilitator. And the idea that an expert or an authority can fix things is really not helpful, or to be more specific, is not helpful in complex contexts. To use David Snowden's language, it might work for clear and complicated contexts, but it doesn't work for complex or chaotic contexts. We have to work together, each of us using our perspective and position and power,
Yes,
and try stuff out and see what we can do. But if I think about our field and the field of organizational learning and organizational consulting and organizational facilitation, I think the idea of the expert consultant or book writer or professor knowing what other people ought to do and telling them what they ought to do, and then other people just doing it, I don't think that works very often, at least not in my experience.
We agree.
Yeah, I think it's spot on with what we experience. We often talk about the performance paradigm, where when people engage in a transformation effort, they think that their company or their teams or whichever problem that they were looking at is going to go from A to B, and it's just like this straight line up, right? And then what they discover is very quickly there is crisis 1 and crisis 2 and crisis 3, and that each time you hit that rock bottom of a crisis, what's going to have you move towards that future, or are you just going to go back to business as usual? And I guess what you're pointing to is that as a facilitator, as a consultant, you're there to support that clarifying so that they can then choose which way they're going to go, but they'll do whatever they do. And
Yeah.
And often they don't realize that there's a delay in the system to the results you want to see because it just takes time. And
So I
so,
think all of that is true. The motion I always make when I'm talking about this is it's really not a straight line. It's feeling your way forward around constraints and affordances and trial and error. I had a colleague, now deceased, Bill O'Brien, who's actually quite a prominent character in Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. At the time, he was the president of Hanover Insurance. And Bill used to say it takes 9 months to make a baby, no matter how many people you put on the job. So, yes, systems have their own speed of things. And he also used to say it's not a good idea to pull up the radishes to see how they're growing. So I think this point about things not being straightforward and things taking time, these are really very important points.
I have another question for you. And what sort of advice would you give to those seeking to align their personal growth with broader societal impact?
Well, I do have a piece of advice, but it's more of a riddle than a recipe. And it is the piece of advice given in the first chapter of the book, Habit 1, Act Responsibly. I guess I'm turning the question on its head. What I'm going to say is something that I think is important. Many people have said this in other terms and languages. I think the place to start is what is my role and what is my responsibility in the world, in my family, in my organization, in my community, in my country, and what does that demand of me? When I say what is my role and what is my responsibility, this is not straightforward. We all have we're part of multiple systems. We have multiple roles as parents and bosses and citizens and all of these different roles. And therefore, we all have multiple responsibilities. And in practice, we're making decisions about what to focus on and what the trade-offs are. Often our different responsibilities are intention. So for me, the starting question is, what is my role? What is my responsibility? And then how can I live up to that? How does my personal development contribute to what I'm supposed to be doing in the world? And when I say this is something many people have said, this is the whole subject, I guess, of moral and ethical and spiritual inquiry that I wouldn't consider myself an expert in, which is what am I supposed to be doing in the world? But I guess the opposite, which is saying this is what I want, this is what's important to me, this is my purpose, this is my ambition. This is a very small question, and I don't think gets you very far.
I mean, his question at the bottom of the U is what is this life? Who is the self and what is the life work, right? The life work. It's not even purpose. It's what's wanted of this life.
Yes. So yes, it's the same domain as what you just quoted from Otto, but I'm asking it not in the larger sense of what's my life purpose, and I'm asking it in this circumstance today, what do I need to do next? What is needed of me next?
Right. Yeah. The everyday choices, everyday actions.
That's why the book is called Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, which is What do we need to do day to day? And the first of the 7 habits is act responsibly.
That's a good start, actually.
And what's your definition of collective consciousness?
I read this in the notes you sent me, Dr. Ramesh, and I just wrote collective consciousness question mark. I don't even know what it means. What does it mean?
Look at systems and how people are interrelated, interconnected.
Yeah.
If you get that you're one with humanity and there's no separation, the silos gets reduced, and maybe, that is collective consciousness.
I'm from Montreal, so it is a rule that I have to quote Leonard Cohen at least once in every conversation. And he has a song where he says, although all may be one in the higher I, down here where we live it is two. I've written at great length many times, I would say quite inadequately, including in habit 2 of this new book, that there's 3 things that are all true, and you've mentioned one of them. And so I'm pretty fierce that we need to use all 3 lenses, not just one. So one lens is we're part of a larger whole. This is true, and that's what he means by all may be one in the higher I. But it's not the only thing that's true. We're also selves and wholes in ourself. And to acknowledge other people as wholes with boundaries and ambitions and needs and powers and agendas is crucial. To ignore that, I think you will not understand anything about what's happening in the world. I think it's a terrible error. Martin Luther King Jr. said, power without love is reckless and abusive, but love without power is sentimental and anemic. And then he went on to talk about justice. So I've worked a lot on this question of how to work with love, this sense of being part of a larger whole, or the drive to unite the separated, but also how to work with power, which is the drive of every living being to realize itself, and how to work with justice, the form that allows both of these to coexist. When I wrote a book about an early version of this, an early partial version of this, a book called Power and Love. Yes. And my son got married a little while after that book was published, and he made the mistake of asking a newly published author to make remarks at his wedding. My remarks maybe were not exactly appropriate for a wedding, but I do think what I said to him and his bride was true and helpful, which is that I hope they would become one and also properly two. So just to push back, Ramesh, I really think it's a serious error to focus only on the sense in which we are one. That's true, but the contrary is also true. Somebody asked me in a meeting last week, was I arguing against John Lennon when he said all we need is love? And I said, I'm sorry, but I do disagree with John Lennon, which I know is heretical, but anyhow, I do.
What you've just said takes me to your other book, which has been translated into Vietnamese, which is Collaborating with Your Enemy. What happens there when you have to work with somebody that you can't see eye to eye?
Well, this book is really at the very center of my and Reos's work of the past 30 years. Collaborating with the enemy is a dramatic way of saying it. The less dramatic would be to say collaborating across difference, or collaborating with unlike others is the phrase I use in the book Everyday Habits. But what I've discovered, or what I've noticed, is it's increasingly important for us to work together across difference, across organizational difference, or personality difference, or political difference, or cultural or racial difference. This is increasingly important. The opposite of working together across difference is we work apart, or one of us tries to subjugate or wipe out the other, and we're seeing a lot of that in the world these days. So I think it's increasingly important to work across difference, and it's increasingly difficult to work across difference for many reasons. this task of collaborating with unlike others, working with people we don't agree with or like or trust, is getting more important and more difficult. And so that book, and I've just spent the better part of the last year rewriting it completely. There'll be a new edition in November of this year, almost completely new. But it says we may not want to work with people we don't agree with or like or trust, or who we believe to be our enemies. And I'm not saying you have to. You may be able to work around them or against them. I'm not arguing that's wrong. But if you want to work with them, then a particular approach is required. And the best way I could summarize the particular approach that's required is that I think what's required is to lower the bar. That we sometimes think that if we're to work with others, we need to agree on what's the problem, what's the solution, what's the plan, what are the principles, what are the values. And it would be lovely to reach agreement on these things, but I think it's usually not necessary. This is the surprise. And if we insist on doing that, then we will fail. We make something collaborating across different difficult. And if we impose those restrictions or assumptions or conditions, then we make it impossible. I'm arguing in that book, and less pointed way in the book, Everyday Habits, that what's required is, a willingness to tolerate difference and disagreement and conflict.
Yeah. So it doesn't all have to be smooth, right? You have to tolerate the quirks or the things that don't quite, I guess, because one word that I think was often prized today is the word alignment, right? That is another nice way to say that, everyone's got to agree. We say it's not agreement, but ultimately that's what we're saying. Yeah, it's a tricky.
Yes, and
it's
I'm arguing the opposite. I'm arguing that it is often impossible and usually unnecessary. And if we take that too far, the result will be authoritarian imposition. I'm not a political philosopher, but I do like the work of Isaiah Berlin, who wrote very eloquently on the danger of insisting on agreement on values. He said it's not possible, and the result is violence. And he used to quote Immanuel Kant, who said, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing is ever made." So the desire to make things harmonious and aligned and agreed is, I think, fruitless and extremely dangerous.
That's also part of the struggle that we have in our work. Typically, when somebody says, well, this is not what I want to have a different set of value, or I prefer to do it this way, then it seems that the only option is that person leaves the organization. What is the practice, or what will they allow the management or the leadership to hold for those differences? What might be called fundamental differences in how we work together?
Well, I've changed my view of that in rewriting Collaborating with the Enemy, and I realize there's two ways to deal with this, not one. And so this is actually required a big change in the structure of the book and certainly the argument of the book. I think one way is to insist, using your example, that all the members of the organization subordinate their individual agendas to the agenda of the organization. In other words, leave your own agendas at the door. If you don't like this, then find another job. And that can work. I think that's the single biggest change in the second edition of the book, is to say that can work. If it's a good job for other reasons, because we're doing great things and the pay is good, and I'm interested in what we're doing, then I will, and I'm deliberately using this word, subordinate myself to the organization and more directly to the boss. So that's the classical answer, and I don't think it's wrong. That's the change in the book. that's what I call conventional collaboration. So that's one answer. Another answer is to say, no, we're going to have a looser organization where we're going to recognize or allow or give space for people who have different agendas and objectives and values. And by definition, that's a less aligned organization, but it allows us to engage a much broader range of, of, of people and to deal with greater complexity and greater conflict. So I've said, and I call that stretch collaboration. So that conventional collaboration works in situations which are or can be made to be low in complexity and low in conflict, but in situations that are not, and cannot be made to be low in complexity and low in conflict. In other words, that are high in complexity and or high in conflict, then if we're going to work together, stretch collaboration is required. And if we can't make that work, then we have to work apart or against one another. So what I've just said is not included in the first edition. It was not clear to me at all, and I'm quite happy with that progress in the thinking.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, then maybe that is a good segue to the next question. What's one belief that you've held, right, around how your approach to work or personal mastery that's changed in the last decades?
Many, and as I said, my every one of my books starts, I thought I understood, and then I realized I didn't. So I do that a lot. But I think the most fundamental change, which is the change between the first book, Solving Tough Problems, and the second book, Power and Love, and which we talked about earlier, is recognizing that it's not true that all you need is love. That it's not true that connecting and engaging and dialoguing and being one is the only important thing. And I realized that by reflecting very deeply and at great length on this sentence in one of the final speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, as I quoted before, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And to recognize that both are required, and in particular, the emphasis I had been giving, and that many people in the soul community give, that what's important is, you called it collective consciousness or oneness, or seeing ourselves as part of larger wholes, or actually not even differentiated from larger wholes, essentially one. I think this is not a helpful way to think about things at all. With apologies to John Lennon.
One last question. I'm going to ask that one. So, what's the one thing about your daily life that would surprise people? What's the one thing that you do, like a routine that will surprise people?
I think people would be surprised how much I enjoy watching television.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Adam. It was enjoyable to get the pushbacks and to get us thinking too about some of what we hold is very transparent to us, but we really enjoyed having this conversation with you. And we look forward to more such conversations when you're in Vietnam.